A very good morning, and you're not in the wrong podcast. You are with Preach FM. You are with your typical host, Robert. This will be the first ever episode in English. I never really thought about, or I thought about doing it in English, to be honest, but we never really did it because it was never really needed, to be honest. But now we are in a situation where I have a guest which I was highly interested to speak to, a colleague of mine in my, let's call it, day job, who will introduce himself in a minute. And I think the things he's working on a daily basis with this team also are way too interesting to not have this conversation. So if you feel comfortable in hearing this in English, and I think most of you will regularly listen to English podcasts as well, I will be very happy to have you within that podcast. If you don't feel comfortable in listening to this in English, just skip this episode. The next will be in German again. So yeah, that's just as a quick let's say note about why I'm speaking in English, and most of you will be surprised how good or bad my English is, from wherever you're coming from. But my today's guest is, as I said, very interesting, and too interesting to not have him on the show. So please introduce yourself. Who are you and what are you doing?
Hi, so my name is Bob, or Robert McArdle. I am Director for Forward-Looking Threat Research, Cybercrime Research in Trend Micro. And I head up two teams. One is very much focused on the criminal underground, understanding what actors are doing today and taking an intelligence approach to kind of stay ahead of them. And the second one is focused on the next 1 to 3 years of where we think infrastructure, cybercrime, and user behavior is going to evolve. And the whole point of that is to then predict where we think the next threat landscape will move to for our executives and also customers as well. And that's also the team that are responsible for all investigations with law enforcement in Trend Micro. So we do that as well. And for your German listeners, I must apologize. I did actually do German in school, but I remember very little. So unless we want to fill this podcast with me asking for directions to the nearest train station or something, I don't think I can contribute much more than that.
I think that's good enough. And I have the same with French. I learned French in school, but it was that, let's say, school-based French. And the first time I then got into France, I realized that I couldn't even order a croissant in a proper way, and I tried to order it in French, and they just spoke to me in English.
Of course.
Which was fair enough, but yeah, it's totally fine. I think many Germans underestimate their English skills, and they rather do it perfectly fine and if they don't do it perfectly fine, they just don't do it. And I always encourage them to just speak English. I think most of them just underestimate how good their English is. But you told you told us already what you're doing, and I think they're very interesting things. I can always encourage everyone to go on, especially the Trend Micro blog and other resources as well. Not because I want to do any advertisement about Trend at the moment, because yes, I'm working for Trend, but because I think the things you're doing are really not about Trend or any products or features or whatsoever. It's really about the basic things we have to deal with at the moment. And as you told us, we maybe or most likely have to in the future. For anyone new to that whole field, you talked about cybercrime, you talked about the underground and other things. And what are the essential basics, especially about the modern cybercrime? Because cybercrime is not something new, but I would say it changed a lot in the past 5 to 10 years especially. And what are these basic essentials that everyone needs to understand about this?
Sure. So when we talk about cybercrime, there's a couple of different areas. The first thing to get across is quite simply, it is simply crime on the internet, right, or digital crime. And we kind of generally break that down into two broad categories. You have cyber-dependent crime and cyber-enabled crime. Cyber-dependent being you can only carry it out with the means of the internet, something like a ransomware attack, for example. And cyber-enabled would be more like scams and things that have been existing since humans committed crimes, but they've just been amplified to work in a digital medium. So maybe somebody tricking you out of details via an SMS or WhatsApp or that type of thing. So within that space then, there's different motivations for why people would do this. Generally speaking, you can kind of break that down into about 4 major ones, each with their own subtleties. The first is financial gain. So probably the oldest reason for crime, just trying to make money in a way that is more efficient, if you like, than working a 9-to-5 job. The second then would be state interests. So you can think they're about espionage, surveillance from one nation state on another nation state or organizations, just to do the foreign policy of the state effectively, right? To protect their citizens, get ahead of their competitors, that kind of thing. Third category, broadly speaking, is something we call hacktivism. And that is essentially the word hacking plus activism put together. So this would be the equivalent to a street protest on the internet, where people might have strong opinions about a particular company or government or policy or something, and they would take to the streets with, banners and placards. The internet equivalent of that can be defacing websites and putting up slogans saying, we don't agree with this country's stance on some war or that kind of thing. Or potentially just doing denial of service attacks, to taking their infrastructure offline to show that level of protest. And finally, and it's one that people probably think about a lot when they think about attacks online, but it doesn't really happen that often, is purely destructive attacks. Attacks that have no other reason for existing other than cause harm, right, or cause damage. And the physical world equivalent of that is vandalism, smashing up a shop front or something like that. So those are the kind of 4 general categories we see. They're not even. By far, financial is the biggest in terms of the impact it will have on people, followed by nation state, depending on the organization that you are. And those are the kind of main motivations. And then I can get into talking a little bit more maybe about the actual, when we talk about underground, what is it that we're actually referring to, if that'd be of interest.
I think the underground will be very, very interesting in a minute. We talked about those categories you laid out, I think, for years and years and years. So I think the basic categories in my own experience didn't change completely. I think what changed in my personal view is how blurry those lines got in between. I think like 6 to 7 years ago, I could really well attribute something to a group to a category and whatsoever. And now we have to talk about maybe something that cybercrime, it's also a little bit motivated by political things, like especially hacktivism. I think especially in the beginning of the whole war in Ukraine, we saw so many ransom notes with political messages. Did that change that whole attack? Was that attack carried out to a particular victim? Most likely not. But still, you can see that it has a good influence on those things. Did it get harder the past few years in your role to really say, we attribute this kind of attack to this category?
Yeah, so it's yes and no. So for the majority of attacks, it's still actually relatively easy to put them into a box, right, and to fit neatly. But you're right that there is a growing amount of groups where they really don't fit nicely. They're very much in between two worlds. So some examples of that, you mentioned hacktivism already. So we have seen hacktivism groups that sometimes align very closely with what their state would want, which is normal patriotism, right, for their state in whichever action. So the classic examples recently, with the conflict between Ukraine and Russia or Israel and Palestine, you had people on both sides saying very pro-Palestinian, very pro-Israeli, whichever case it might be. Sometimes from within the country, sometimes outside the country, that they just aligned with those motivations. And then within those groups, obviously there's a lot of free energy, if you like, right? There's a lot of people with hacking skills, maybe not like super advanced ones, but they're still willing to go out and cause damage to the other side. So it makes a certain amount of sense for a nation state to tap into that free energy. If they can put somebody in that community and simply influence it subtly to go in a certain direction that would benefit them. They don't have to be very overt about it. They don't have to say, we are the Ministry for Defense and we want you to go hack this thing. They can just be a senior figure who's respected, seems to be another hacktivist, and says, you know what, let's go target these 10 companies, which came from maybe intelligence, things like that. So we see that kind of murkiness in hacktivism. We also see it between financially motivated crime and state interests. And that happens in kind of two ways. One is we have an emergence of what you could kind of consider to be cyber mercenaries. So most of their time is standard financial cybercrime, where they're looking to make money for themselves. But some of their attacks seem to be very aligned with what would be beneficial to a certain state. While we can't prove it because we don't have their internal records, it seems highly likely they've been essentially contracted in the same way as a defense contractor or something would be. And flipping it the other way around, we've even seen nation states hacking for financial gain. So the most well-known example of this would be DPRK, or North Korea, who have such severe sanctions on them that they need a way to generate money for their country. And one way they have found of doing that is by hacking, in particular, cryptocurrency exchanges, sometimes banks as well, and taking large amounts of money back into the economy, so hundreds of millions. So that really blurs that line between financial gain and the interests of a nation state.
I think that's a particular trend that's going on for years and years and years. I think it started not only maybe with a direct connection between a government and a certain group, but sometimes I think even accepting those groups in your own country and accepting what they are doing is good enough of a message to the West, for example. If you have a certain group acting in your country and they don't really have to face consequences most of the times unless they're doing something in their own country. And I think that evolved over time to now have maybe some direct connections or maybe even hiring for certain operations. Mm-hmm. I think that the thing that stand out the most for me in the past few years was that hacktivism really got better for me. At least the things I saw in terms of hacktivism got better, because if I think back like 6 to 7 years ago, there was always hacktivism. But especially if we think about conflicts, wars and whatsoever, a lot of that was when I talked to those in responsibility in those companies, for example, in defense companies, most of the time they told me the things they saw in terms of activism was like a DDoS attack on their website. But then they always said, yeah, it was in the news. It wasn't good news for us because our website was down for several hours, but does it really make any damage? No, not really. It was bad press, but not anything more. But I think the things you guys saw in terms of hacktivism, at least from my perspective, got more mature, didn't they?
Yeah, so I think a large part of hacktivism, if we go back a little bit further, even to your listeners will probably be familiar with names like Anonymous or Lulzsec or these type of people. And a lot of those were honestly coming from a position where they're, angry teenagers with some level of skill, which in, lots of teenagers, we should say, do things or act out or aggressively or things like that, especially teenage boys, lots of testosterone going around, right? But if they have any level of cyber skills, sometimes they will be in a community that will start acting out online. In the same way as a bit of vandalism, spraying with graffiti in a building, instead of doing that, they are hacking a website and defacing it. Same kind of motivation to stand out among their peers, right? But what we've seen more recently is hacktivist groups that are a bit more organized. They're probably, in a lot of cases, members of financial criminal gangs that have a particular belief structure as well that goes with that. So their day job might be, banking crime or banking like malware and banking, that kind of thing. And then as a side job, they're very pro right wing or left wing or something their country, and they spend some time in the afternoon helping push forward that agenda. So what was very interesting in particular is that when we looked at those two recent conflicts I mentioned, the Israel, Palestine and Ukraine, Russia, there was actually Israel-Palestine is probably one of the most interesting ones, in that we expected when that broke out that we would have like pro-Israeli hacktivist groups and we have pro-Palestinian hacktivist groups going at each other in each other country. What was a bit more surprising was we saw other groups from around the world jump on board. and pick sides. So we saw groups from as far away as we saw one group in Venezuela, which, if I remember correctly, was quite a right wing, like a pro right wing movement for Venezuela, and they sided up more with the Israeli side because for them, what Israel were doing was very close to their beliefs, and they just jumped on board and started helping out. And then you had others who were maybe more like pro kind of Muslim rights communities in parts of Asia that then jumped on the Palestinian side because, again, they identified with that and joined in. So that helped us understand that when we do see these conflicts break out anywhere in the world, at least anywhere in the world that has TV cameras that's going to publicize it, you're going to have these groups from anywhere on the planet jump on board, not just the obvious groups that you might expect.
That's very, very interesting, and I think that's basically aligning to the society in general, I would say. I think most of the things we see in that is not really a cyber phenomenon, like some of us sometimes think. I think cyber is just another way to have this fight, discussion, however you want to call it, and another tool to maybe, for example, have greater power if you are 100,000 miles away from that conflict, to overestimate it. But it's easier from Venezuela to do cyber than to do anything else in that conflict. And I think that's the same like we see in many espionage things. I think there's still a lot of traditional espionage going around. I had some episodes with former BND guy over here, but I think cyber is sometimes just a bit more convenient. There's not so much risk in getting physically caught, for example, in a certain country. And I think that's one of the main reasons. Sometimes cyber is not only there for cyber. Cyber is there just as another vehicle to carry out things. You talked about underground, or you didn't really talk about underground, but I want to get into underground because I think there are too many myths about the underground. It's always like, oh, that's the dark side of the internet. And I don't like these concepts or these talking points because sometimes it's not really too much different. Some of the things we publicly see, but I think that's just the tip of the iceberg. The things that really get published, all those very, very public marketplaces, for example, which you will most likely talk about. But I'm pretty honest, and I think that's just the tip of the iceberg of things that could be possible in, let's put it in that sentence like others, like in the dark side of the internet. Yeah. Tell me a little bit about the basic concepts of the underground, how the collaboration is within there, and how it evolved in the past few years especially.
Sure. So when we talk about cybercrime underground, it's really just a catch-all term for us to describe where do cyber criminals interact with each other in a community, right? And within that, there's multiple different methods that are used. Generally speaking, you would have kind of bulletin forums where you can post with threads and replies and so on. You would have marketplaces where you can buy and sell goods, be they stolen, account details or malware or whatever. Then you would have, increasingly, it's more common to use Telegram. Even with the recent changes and the arrests around Telegram, it's still quite common. And then you would have very private communities as well, which generally are for very senior members of the community who now value their kind of operational security much higher than any ability to interact with newcomers. So they just, it's like an elite club, if you like, right, that some of these hang out in. So within that, to further complicate things a little bit, people think it's all on dark web or deep web. Those two terms, which are completely different things, by the way, get thrown around interchangeably. But to make it simpler, the vast majority of these are just on the internet. They're just a website. You may need to have somebody vouch for you to be able to get an account on it, or you might have to pay a large amount of money, which a researcher probably won't do, but for a criminal, it's pocket change type thing, to get access. But they are generally on the internet, right? With some disguises on where the actual server is hosted from technical means. Or you do have a few that would be on these more like Tor networks and things you've heard of, but generally not so much in the case of cybercrime. That tends to be more for people who want to buy drugs, weapons, things along those lines, right? So which is sometimes cybercrime adjacent, but generally it's a different world. So the majority of them kind of on the clear web. And within that, it's important to make the distinction that there isn't one underground community. It's divided based on culture and language. So some of our like competitors in this space will talk about the Russian underground or Chinese underground and so on. We always use the word Russian speaking underground or English speaking underground and Spanish speaking and Chinese speaking, because it's really united based on the language that people speak and the shared culture to a degree. So if we talk about, for example, the English speaking underground, we're not just talking about people who live in London. We're talking about, a large part of the world, including people in France or somewhere that can still communicate in English well enough to interact. Same for the Russian speaking underground. You're talking both Russia itself, but also Ukraine, Belarus, Kazakhstan, loads of places. People in Israel who have, Russian heritage. So all of those would kind of communicate in that community. And those different communities have different levels of maturity as well. And maybe focus. So we would see, for example, very generally speaking, the most mature of all those communities in terms of the offerings would be the Russian-speaking one. The most insular would be the Chinese one. They tend to hacking Chinese, right, as opposed to the rest of the world for the majority. One very, very focused on banking would be the kind of Portuguese, which is generally Brazil, right? So Portuguese and Spanish, and so on. So each has their own kind of niches to them. So there is no one underground. It's a bit more nebulous, and I think we can pick apart a little bit and go into details and services and things that are offered in there.
Yeah, absolutely. But I think that's a very good overview and a very much needed overview because, as I said, in my own experience, everything is being thrown in one basket, and that's basically the whole discussion. And everybody still thinks they have to go into a Tor network. Mm-hmm. To see those things, and most of the times you just need someone to vouch for you. And even with that, I saw so many forums where even that is not really much needed. You can still see those things happening, and those forums are up for quite a long time most of the time, and even if they get taken down by a provider or someone else, they pop up in a matter of a minute somewhere else, and the URL is just, just one tip the other. I think they're pretty much prepared for those things, but we will also talk about takedowns in general later this episode. There was a time when I sat in the audience during I think it was a podium discussion, and everybody that knows me knows that I hate podium discussions because typically they are not discussions, they are just people reassuring each other. But there was one guy who said you can get access to most Fortune 500 companies, even with administrative access for a matter of, like 500 euros. And I was standing up and I tried to cancel that whole thing because I was like, sometimes it's easier as people think, but not that easy and typically not that cheap. And if you see things like that, you can pretty sure that this could also be a scam because scammers will scam other scammers as well. And I think that's really a thing that also got a lot of traction the past few years in the so-called underground, that even those things are scams so many times. What do you think about that? And especially about sometimes this, sorry for that bullshit talking about you just have to spend $100 and then you're in a Fortune 500 company.
Yeah, so I think that's definitely overblown by whoever that person was. Unfortunately, there's a lot of kind of immature reporting on what happens on the criminal underground. Like in our team at this point, we put out nearly 50 reports on different elements of the ecosystem. So we understand it quite well at this stage. But there's a lot of scams. There is a lot, of course, it's criminals selling to other criminals. So of course, some of them will scam each other. They're criminals after all, right? It's in the name. So you will definitely see some offerings that look too good to be true and genuinely are. So especially with access to companies, how that generally works is you will have one category of criminal who excel at gaining access to a company. Could be through phishing emails, remote vulnerabilities in their cloud infrastructure and so on. And what they will do is they will go around, normally not so much targeting a company. They won't have these are my 3 targets today and I'm going after them. more looking for some low-hanging fruit, kind of attack a whole bunch of people who use a certain software, and then very much like sifting through what they got, a bit like panning for gold, and being like, okay, we got some tiny company, we don't really care about them, leave them alone, but this one looks big, so let's have a look at this. And then once they do that, they'll explore around a little bit inside the network to get some idea of who is it that they actually have access to and what level of access do they have. And then those initial compromised people will go into a forum or Telegram and essentially sell what they have. So a bit like somebody coming back from fishing trip, right, on a trawler and saying, today, we have fresh salmon and we have cod and everything else. They'd be like, okay, I have a Fortune 500. I also have a small company in Spain, and I have, something that looks like a government over here in a different part of the world. And they'll set pricing accordingly for those. So obviously, the small company in Spain might be €1,000. The Fortune 500 company that you genuinely seem to have, almost admin rights to, is a lot more than €1,000, right? So you can sell that for much more, because what will then happen is groups, especially those affiliated with ransomware, will buy that access. They will kind of validate it, move around the network, make sure that it is what you actually sold them, and then look to monetize that. So while they might have bought access to, say, a Fortune 500 for even tens of thousands or 100,000, if they can successfully ransom that, they know based on their revenue and things, they can ask them for millions. So obviously profitable, right? So it's not the case you can buy access to any Fortune 500 you want on there. You can probably certainly buy access to some of them. You can also buy access to some breached accounts of individuals within that company for relatively cheap, but that's not the same as having full access to the entire network.
I sat down by the end of the year with the CISO of a very, very big or large German company, one of the largest German companies, and they are doing, let's say, they themselves call it threat hunting in the underground. They use some commercial services for that, but also have their own people really going in those forums and look out for things that could seem to be something from that company, if it's an account, if it's an access or whatsoever. And he basically told me if they see something account related, yes, they document it, yes, they report it, but they don't care too much about this, because that identity is not only protected by the password or only by the username. They have too many other factors coming in, and yes, they will flag it, and sometimes they will reset, for example, the account, but they know what they would care about more and what they would care about less. And especially on LinkedIn these days, I see so many screenshots of forums and, there's access to this company and this company. And sometimes I just think, like, have you ever looked at this? This is way too good to be true. And sometimes those things are even real. So for example, we have access to that and that from a Fortune 500 company. But I think sometimes access is not access. Maybe it's a totally unimportant EC2 instance in AWS with no connection at all to any other asset, with no information on it. Yes, it's still an asset of this company, so it's a legit thing. But I do think, and correct me if I'm wrong, the real high profile ones are typically not getting posted in most forums. It's a lot on these, let's say, private groups that you were talking about.
Yeah. So what happens is, especially in a career as a cyber criminal, right? Because your career will continue as a cyber criminal and continue to evolve, and you get more senior, unless essentially you get arrested, right? And the number of cyber criminals who get arrested compared to the amount of them that exist is relatively low percentage, right? And the same for normal crime as well, by the way, not just cyber crime. So these people keep getting better and better. They get better connected. They get more respect from their peers. Like some people would say, they will recognize a name and say, well, if this person says they have access to that company, it's true. It's like they never lie. They're very good at their job. They've before they've even put the name up there and offered it for sale, they've validated that they actually have what they think they have. And those people then, as a result, because they have that reputation, they're not going to want to walk into the more open forums and say, this is what I have. Because honestly, the people they're can't afford to buy it off them, right? Or having the maturity to know what to do with it properly. So they would then go to these more mature groups who maybe some people have ran ransomware for the better part of a decade and also know what they're doing. Because quite often at that sort of a level of offering, they won't just sell it for a fee. They won't just be, give me my 10,000 or 50,000 and happy days. They might have like a fee with a kicker. So something like 50,000 and I want 2% of the final ransom, right? And of course, they could get scammed by the criminal group they work with, but the likelihood is they won't, because there's a level of respect and they want to work with them again in the future, right? So for the sake of 2% of probably millions, you have another one coming in a month later or 2 months later and everybody wins. So yeah, you do definitely see that at that level of maturity. It also is a level of protection for them, because if they're trading in these more closed communities that are very invite only, very kind of elite access, it's less likely that they would be monitored by, let's say, law enforcement or researchers, and therefore your security from being ever arrested is lower.
And in the end, I think we all have to say it's a supply chain. They have to work to each other. They need each other. An access broker who doesn't have any clients who use those things, just don't get any money. And those groups who may be not too much interested in getting the access themselves, they need the access broker, for example, to get the access. When we're already talking about groups and supply chain and whatsoever, I think the thing that accelerated especially ransomware in the past few years the most was the as a service model, which still from time to time, if you look into LinkedIn, for example, my favorite network in the world, some people still want to sell you as a new thing, but I cannot count how long this thing is going around. But I think it was one of the main accelerators of ransomware was really the as a service model. Can you tell me a little bit about the history maybe of these as a service models and how they are really influencing this whole thing? Because in my mind, it's very diverse. It's from not so mature groups who really use a lot from others, so affiliates are really not that mature, to maybe highly sophisticated, let's more call it supply chain than as a service models.
Yeah, sure. So for talking about as a service model, it's definitely not a recent thing, as you mentioned. So it's actually more useful to go back in a bit of ancient history when it comes to cybercrime. But if we go back to very early days of early banking Trojans, if any of your listeners remember names like Zeus or SpyEye or things like that, even actually before then, if you were a group that were running a banking Trojan, which was kind of the state of the art of cybercrime at the time before ransomware arrived, you very much developed it all yourself. So it was maybe a group of 5-6 people working together. One would be like the coder for the actual malware. Another one would try to distribute it, via phishing or whatever. But they worked as a group and they built it and they used their own code. With Zeus and SpyEye then started the idea of selling access to the code, to the service. So they might have 100 users of the same software toolkit. And if a new version was released, people could download it and use it. So suddenly you have not just a software product, but essentially a service, right? It's regularly updated and it keeps ahead of any detections that, security vendors had and all that kind of stuff for you. And that then gave birth to, around the same time, people realizing you could do that with just about any element of cybercrime, be that hosting, bulletproof hosting, or phishing as a service, or cash out as a service, or anything else, right? It started becoming very much the core group don't have to do it. They just simply have to contract somebody who can do it for them for an arranged fee. And that over time gets incredibly scalable. And makes it relatively trivial for someone to be a criminal entrepreneur. They just need to have an idea, and then they just contract. They need some seed money, to get themselves started. But then they think if their idea was, I have a really good idea for like a phishing campaign and I want to deliver ransomware, that's their idea. And then they go to a phishing provider. They get them to send millions of emails per day with their lure. They work with a ransomware group of their choice, whoever's giving them the best rates. They, put that in, and they probably include some like cash out and Bitcoin processing and all that kind of stuff. And they just stitch it together, and then it'll work for them. So if you want to kind of have an equivalent of what happens in the real world or legitimate world, it's very much like the Amazon AWS model, where everything is a service or everything is an API. And it's trivial then to put these all together and build apps and so on. And it just becomes hyper scalable over time. And the other thing why it really supports a vibrant criminal ecosystem is that when you have that many service providers, there's competition between each of them. There's more than one provider of any given service most of the time, and that drops pricing, like in any free market in the world. And it also adds redundancy. So if one of them gets taken over by law enforcement and taken down, people can move to the next provider. They will have to do some retooling and fix things up, and it won't have all the same features that they liked with the previous one, but generally it works pretty good. So I would say that whole as a service model of crime makes it as incredibly scalable as it is, even more so than physical world crime. And along with the arrival of blockchain, which is the other major influence of modern cybercrime, that is what allows something like ransomware to operate at the kind of scales that it's gotten to.
Now we talked a lot about let's put it from an attack's perspective, about the advantages or the benefits of as-a-service models, but I think in the past few years there were also some downsides for groups as well as affiliates when it comes to as-a-service models. I can only think about the time that, I don't know which group it was, but one group, let's say, had to apologize publicly about, at least they told the public that affiliates targeted hospitals, children hospitals in particular, whatsoever, and this is not on our code of conduct, which seems to be a bit odd for a criminal group.
Mm-hmm.
But things like that, like affiliates doing things that the group is, again, very odd, but not proud of, or could even damage the reputation, not in the public opinion. I mean, they're still criminals, but within the underground, let's put it like that. Have you some examples for that, where these as-a-service models really got out of hand, for example?
Yeah, there's been a couple, and that's ultimately when, so for example, it happens very much in ransomware, because ransomware is the final thing you see as the victim, right? So there can be multiple stages, there can be multiple groups that have actually been in your network and sold access to each other or dropped each other and so on. But what you will see is the ransomware demand, normally, at the end. So as a result, you associate that entire attack chain, which might have been 3 or 4 groups who've all taken a different percentage or whichever way they split it, but you'll associate it with the actual ransomware group. So there's pros and cons to that. In one sense, the ransomware group constantly gets more publicity, which means if you go Google them on or Bing, if you're a Bing user, on the day that it happens, you look them up and say, these are a serious group. They're not messing around. They hit a lot of people. We probably have to deal with them. But the downside is those groups don't have complete control over what their affiliates do or who they target and so on. So it's a little bit outside their control. So some kind of more famous examples when that would happen is if somebody hit, for example, a hospital, like you mentioned. There was a hospital, I think it's in Canada, literally called a Hospital for Sick Children, and was ransomed. I mean, no criminals are good people, right? But you have to be a particularly low level of scum to do something like that. But also politically as well. So we had, for example, where I live, I'm living over in Ireland. We had the HSE, which is our health service executive. I don't know the equivalent in Germany, but essentially the part of the government that runs all the hospitals. They were ransomed. At the time, it was by Conti ransomware. Although it was a different group that ultimately installed Conti in the first place on the network. And that becomes a major political thing, because you've just taken the entire health system of a country offline. And to make matters worse, at the time, Ireland were actually sitting on the Security Council for the United Nations, which rotates. So you've not just hit a normal country, you've hit a major security player, at least for that 6-month period. You also have things like the Colonial Pipeline in America, again, took a whole pipeline offline, or effectively the pipeline took themselves offline for safety reasons, but it still compromised it. And that again becomes a major incident. So you now are, let's say, a ransomware group, which in the case of Conti, we know were generally Russian speaking because they were breached. But these ransomware groups sitting, making money, generally being left alone by the states that they're in, because as long as they don't target the state, they're generally okay. But you will certainly get a phone call, I would imagine, from your intelligence services if the president of your country has been rang up probably by a president of another country saying, what's going on? Like, you do not get to take healthcare systems offline. Like, get your criminals in order, otherwise people will retaliate. And nobody wants that conversation. Nobody sitting in Moscow wants to have a call saying the Kremlin got a call because of what you did. We need to have a conversation. So it raises that as a service issue where you don't have full control over all of your ecosystem supply chain can be risky for some of these criminals.
And I think it's a question about how much spotlight is acceptable, because you want to have spotlight within your peer group most likely, because you want to have new customers or new affiliates, let's put it like that. But you don't want to have typically public spotlight, because that could lead to political discussions, that could lead to things that are out of your own control in the end, and you don't want to have to do that. I think especially with large as a service models, I think it's the same like in, let's say, usual industries. You want to have a good market share, you want to have as many affiliates as possible, but you don't want to have, let's say, dumb affiliates who, and I don't think it's about the own code of conduct, it's more or less about the spotlight, as you told us. And I think especially when we have a look into some as a service models, and I think even the typical crime that wasn't cyber related 15 years ago, like gang crime and whatsoever, we saw some examples that cyber could be the next industry or the next business for them. Mm-hmm. And I think especially those groups could get into as a service models, very likely, because they don't have any own skills or any proper skills. Maybe they have one or two people, and these could be especially, I think, affiliates where groups could be a bit cautious. Is there any trend that, in your opinion, or to your knowledge at least, that groups could be pickier in the future when it comes to having affiliates?
Yeah, there certainly is. And it happens more with the top tier groups, top tier ransomware groups, because you ultimately, if you just think of the career of a cyber criminal, they probably start, relatively smaller. They start making some money out of, maybe they write malware or they do some sort of scams and so on. And they're generally making a wage that is probably equivalent to a well-paid IT worker in their country. Then over time they get better and they start moving into other groups, and now they're definitely in the wages category that is way above what a worker would get, right? Tens of thousands per month or something in a part of the world where that's not a kind of salary that you would get. But once you get to the real top tier of some of these ransomware groups where they're genuinely making millions per month, you get different sort of concerns. So if you think about it, you have to think about the human beings involved here. They may have a decade of experience at this point or longer, in which case they're probably in their mid-30s, right? 20s, mid-30s, something like that, which means it's highly likely to have kids. They have made more money than they really ever need. They certainly, like, college is sorted for the kids, the house is paid off, all that kind of stuff. So you just have money going essentially into a bank account or to a lavish lifestyle of some description. And the more that happens, you switch your mental model and maturity from how do I make more money and how do I make loads to how do I protect the money that I have. And I cannot lose it or my freedom under any circumstances, because suddenly I have a 10-year-old in school or, somebody in college or something, that how do I support those? So the risk model changes, and as a result, the appetite for dealing with looser affiliates goes as well. They just want a predictable, ideally high volume of income still coming in, but with people that they can trust, that they know won't mess up or shouldn't mess up compared to going wider. And that happens at those more elite levels of cybercrime, where they can afford to work with those type of people, because they never want to be at the point where they become a bargaining chip for their government in particular. they certainly don't ever want to commit a crime in their country, because that will be a red flag. That will be a big problem. But in a lot of cases, people at that level, being honest, the local country will have a pretty good idea who they are. I mean, if you have somebody who, officially is claiming some form of social welfare and driving a Ferrari around, doesn't add up, right? So they will have been investigated, and they may have, depending on the country, they will have been generally arrested, or it's only because the country haven't found out a way to prove what they've done yet is the only reason they haven't been arrested. Or in other countries, they're friendly to it and like, well, this person hasn't committed any crimes against their citizens. They're actually bringing money into the economy because they're stealing from other countries. So we let them do what they're doing, but we will certainly keep a note on them. So any of those, you don't want to end up in a position where 5 years later, the political landscape changes. Suddenly, your country you live in, and maybe, let's say, the United States or something, are a bit more friendly with each other, and you become a bargaining chip where they're like, you give us that person we've wanted for 5 years, we'll throw them in a jail in the US, and we will give you, a weapons program or something that we know you need, something along those lines. If you're ever at that level, then you're in serious trouble, because you'll be traded in a heartbeat. You're just a person. So they want to avoid that at all costs.
I think I saw some examples in the past few years, especially in Western countries, where it's a bit harder, I think, if you get this kind of money to really use it, or to really show it. Because, as you told us, it will be like in any other crime. If you're getting loads and loads of money that nobody really understands where you have it from and how you spend it, that there will always be someone who has a red flag in his hand and say, hey, this guy doesn't make that much money. I saw some examples in the past, like, let's say 10 years in Western countries, also in Germany, where people had such a good job in IT in their daytime that it wasn't explainable how much money they got, but they were very good in spending that money, didn't spend too much, didn't spoil too much with Ferraris or whatsoever. But at a certain point, they had to get into conventional crime like money laundering because it was just too much. Even with crypto, you cannot do everything. You cannot hide everything, especially. At a certain point, it will be suspicious. And there were some very, very good examples, especially in Western countries. When we look into those people who do those things, who do the hard work, let's put it like that, how's recruitment in those kinds of jobs going? How are they getting those people?
Yeah, you mean how are they recruiting, let's say, other kind of hacker criminal types, or how are they recruiting?
Yeah, a ransom operator, for example. How do they get the people who are doing the heavy lifting within the access they have?
So I think at the lower level, it's very much, the nice thing about the as a service model is it's very much like almost going on Amazon, right? And buying things based on reviews, right? So people will describe very clearly what the service or software or whatever it is that they supply does. They will normally have demo videos so you can get a feel for what it looks like. Multiple people in the same thread will post their reviews, positive and negative, right? So you do your homework the same way as before you buy something online, especially if you're going to spend a bunch of money on something like, a TV, you read loads of reviews and you get a feeling, you're like, this one's good enough. And then at the more entry level, that's would be how people get kind of recruited. They will also sometimes genuinely do what normal recruiters do. They will give them technical tests. They will be like, okay, we're going to hire you for ransomware or malware, let's say. Write some code for us that does the following thing. We will pay you a fee for that. And then based on how well you do, we will decide whether or not we take you on board. And we saw that in the case of the Conti ransomware, which had its internal chats breached by a security researcher and pushed online. We could see some of those sort of interviews and things, and even the internal chatter then of the group where they were discussing how the interview went in the same way as any company would. Like, the person has fantastic skills, but came across as a little bit weird in the interview. Like, I'm not entirely sure we want to work with this person. Just, normal human nature stuff. So they do that. Then at the higher levels, at the more elite levels, it's very much based on word of mouth and vouching. So I've worked with this person before. They did an excellent job for us. I would highly recommend them. And then that recommendation just keeps going around until people have, in the same way as you would refer people to a company or to a colleague and things that you have a high value in. It goes by that. It's all about reputation. So reputation then becomes a currency as important as actual money to a degree, because you cannot mess up at a certain level. If you burn your reputation, it's very hard to rebuild it from scratch with those sort of actors.
You already talked about that we call it, for example, Russian speaking, Chinese speaking, whatsoever, but how global are those structures within those groups? Or are they more regional based on language, for example, or even on a regional border, for example, in a certain country? I would suppose there are samples or examples for global groups, but also for very regional groups. How does that look like?
So it's actually gotten quite interesting in the last few years. So if we went back maybe 5-6 years, you would very kind of clearly have, let's say, the Russian speaking underground. Generally speaking, Russian speaking, English, Chinese, Spanish, and Portuguese would be the strongest ones. Then a little bit German, a little bit French, right? But generally does. And within that, then there was always a struggle for people to communicate into the different culture. So if you're an English speaker and you go to, let's say, a Russian forum, you can, of course, run things through Google Translate, but it's going to be obvious to any native speaker that you're clearly not from the region. And they wouldn't like to work with those people because they would often associate them and say, well, could be a researcher, could be law enforcement from foreign countries. So you know what, we leave them alone. Or we might work with them on something small, but nothing major, right? That's changing a bit now. I think with the emergence in particular of AI and just how easy it is to write very, very believable language in either direction, it's made it easier, number one, for people to communicate in a different language with a different community, but it's also made it more accepting of that community that you can't really tell sometimes whether people are really part of your trusted community or not, so they're more open to listening to that. So those lines are blurring globally between these different undergrounds. Where we've seen that happen, a major effect is some of the smaller languages, like something like Spanish, that underground has actually shrank in terms of the amount of conversations and things that's happening there, because they're just simply using the English-speaking one or even the Russian-speaking one, right? Because they can, and they're much more mature markets for them to get services from. The other element where we've seen real like borders split up, certainly within the Russian-speaking world, because you would have a large amount of people who would have been Ukraine, Belarus, Russia, and so on, and there's an actual physical conflict going right in the middle of that right now with people who will naturally take sides, right? Some of them literally will be sitting in, East Ukraine or West Ukraine, or they might be outside of that, but they're sympathizing much more with the Russian side or the Ukrainian side. And that has led to certain groups splitting just along political lines. We've also seen just the movement of people. So when a war breaks out, some people just want to get out. They want to get out of Ukraine. They want to get out of Russia, even if they're Russian, like, I don't want to be conscripted to the army. I'm going to leave. And as they've moved, some of them were cyber criminals, of course, to other countries, they brought their cybercrime with them. So suddenly we're seeing cyber criminals based in non-traditional Russian-speaking countries that simply fled from the region. And then as a result, we start seeing some of the local groups being brought into the kind of Russian-speaking underground too, because they probably met the hacking community in the local city they're in, and they're starting bringing them on board. So it's kind of getting a lot more blurred lines in the last couple of years.
That's very interesting. And I think for as you told, I think for some communities it's a bit easier to communicate. I think for some communities it's still harder because there's still a language barrier from time to time. Mm-hmm. And as good as AI sometimes is, I think sometimes the human interaction is not really replaceable. And it's also about trust, as you said. And I think those conflicts could undermine trust between individuals who maybe could have trust to each other to a high degree, but that conflict in the background will undermine it, even though those two individuals could really get good to each other. The last thing I wanted to talk about today, because we had a few more talking points, especially about AI, but if you would like to, I would really love to have somewhere in the future another episode solely about AI, about deepfakes, about the real usage we see in the underground at the moment. But we talked about cybercrime, cybercriminal groups especially, And the last thing we didn't really talk about is law enforcement. Yes, we had it from time to time, but we saw several takedowns the past few years, sometimes a bit of a smaller takedown, maybe of a marketplace, sometimes bigger takedowns of groups. How are those takedowns really impacting the market? Because I think there are a lot of myths around those takedowns. And sometimes people out of the industry really think someone runs into a building and just get people into a prison. And most of the time it's not like that. It's about interrupting infrastructure. It's about interrupting server systems, maybe about getting knowledge about the malware they're using, but not really the typical takedown from typical crime. So can you tell me a little bit about these takedowns? How are they impacting the market? Are they really disrupting those activities? Or are they just forcing them more or less to adapt?
Sure. So the first thing, and I think this is important for anybody listening in to understand, is what is it that law enforcement actually do, right? So people make this mistake that law enforcement, in anything, including not cybercrime, are there to stop every single crime from happening. And if that was the case, then every single law enforcement in the world is failing, right? That's not their goal. Their goal is ultimately to reduce the risk of any of us as citizens of a country to be a victim of crime to as low a level as is possible to do and economically, viable to do, right? So simple case in point, and I'll get into cybercrime in a second. But if I walk down the street, and I'm in Ireland, so if I walk down Dublin, which is our biggest city, I should be able to walk down all the main streets, not be mugged, nobody pull a knife on me, nobody steal my money and everything else. Of course, there's some streets that if I go to, especially late at night, it's a lot more dangerous to go down those streets, as is every capital city in the planet, right? So what law enforcement are doing there is they are policing that and making sure that the risk is low most of the time, unless you do risky things yourself. And when we come to cybercrime law enforcement, we want to get to the same sort of level on the internet. So you should be able to run a business, or you should be able to go online and shop, or any of those things. And 99% of the time, it should be perfectly fine. Of course, if you go to, a site called Greatest Ever Deals on like hardware.com or something, it's probably a bit more suspicious, right? And in the same way as if you buy a TV off somebody who looks incredibly dodgy, probably stolen, you'll have those risks. But most of the time, you should be fine. So within that category, what law enforcement are trying to do is keep the cybercrime to a level that's acceptable. And when we look at some of the big impacts for this year, so I'll take three examples of jobs that were done. One was the takedown of Lockbit, which was by far the largest ransomware in the world. The second was the takedown of LabHost, which was one of the largest phishing services in the world. And the third one was Endgame, which was an operation to take down multiple as-a-service providers of malware that led to some of these skits. So in Lockbit is particularly interesting because you would probably have seen, or your readers have seen, lots of diagrams of maybe pie charts of like which ransomware are the biggest in the world. If you remind me later, a pie chart is a really bad idea for that, but I'll explain why later. But what generally happened was Lockbit had at least 30% of the victims, maybe more, sometimes up to 40%. And that's a bad thing, because when you get to that, it attracts other affiliates to work with Lockbit. Lockbit gets bigger and bigger as an organization and affiliates. And like any human organization, the bigger it gets, the more it has to optimize itself. Just like a company. If you have 100 employees, you can't have a single manager running everything. It doesn't work. You have to put in place more efficient processes, automation, all of that sort of things, which makes it work more efficiently. And when we have that in crime, then we have a problem, because we have something that's working like a factory, just churning out attacks. So with the takedown of Lockbit itself, it's fragmented the market. All those affiliates go to other ransomware groups. And if you looked at a pie chart now, it's much more even. It's this person is 5%, another 6%, 7%, and so on. And as a result, none of those groups get to that level of kind of monopoly of a market where they can be efficient. So as a result, your likelihood of being hit by any one of them and having an impact is lower. And the same with LabHost for phishing and so on. So you want to keep a crime ecosystem kind of like that, at a strangely as this is, as a healthy level of crime. In the same way as if you have a nature ecosystem and you have predators like lions and deers and so on, if you completely remove the predator, the population explodes and suddenly there's no grass and trees and things anymore. You need a healthy level, unfortunately, right, to keep it all in balance. So that's ultimately what law enforcement are trying to do. Of course, they would love to stop all crime, but in reality, that's not what they do. They go after the biggest players or the key enablers of a market that will have the biggest impact when they actually take those down. In terms of what a takedown is actually involving, quite simply, it's ideally you want to take down and an arrest simultaneously. But the takedown is normally mapping out all of the criminals' infrastructure, where their servers, where their Bitcoin wallets, where their everything else that they have to make their business work, and then normally doing a timed operation where all of those are taken offline in a very short period of time, like the same hour ideally, or even minute if possible, because criminals will get alerts as soon as the servers start going offline. They'll get messages on their phone saying, this server's offline, this one's offline. And at that point, you can be guaranteed they are running to their laptop and wiping it, because law enforcement could be kicking the door in 5 minutes' time. So you want to time these as perfectly as possible. That can be tricky to do. Sometimes the people will be in a jurisdiction where arrest is not realistically an option. And I think this year with Lockbit and some of the others, we found a really nice alternative for that. And also, from the law enforcement point of view, it takes a huge amount of collaboration, more than just about any other crime in the world, because you will have multiple countries, sometimes a dozen countries, all having to coordinate. And you have one country who has to, maybe at 3 o'clock in the morning, kick a door in and arrest somebody. At the exact same time, somebody else is going to go in and serve a warrant on a data center, and somebody else is going to seize a Bitcoin wallet. And if any of them are out by a couple of minutes, somebody can get away. So it's a huge logistic challenge, but they've gotten exceptionally good at it in the last couple of years at that level of coordination and trust.
I'm always very surprised about how good these things really go along, because if I only think about Germany, those things wouldn't really function within Germany at the same time, for example. And I think especially on a European level, I think there were many steps taken in the past few years to do those things. Especially when we talk about Lockbit, I think there's a good chunk of conversation still to that day about how effective that whole thing was, because there are always rumors of they weren't really taken down. And I think that's another very interesting thing, is about what's really a takedown, because especially if you don't arrest those people, they still have intellectual property, and they can maybe rearrange, they could maybe build up their own split groups based up on their intellectual property and about their knowledge and whatsoever. What's really a takedown if we leave out the arrests?
Yep. So ideally, the best case scenario is you arrest the entire crew who ran the operation, you take it all offline, and then you truly have neutralized that as a threat, right? In reality, that's rarely the case. Even if all of the people involved were in a country that is friendly, it's unlikely you're going to be able to arrest all of them or have enough evidence to really get every single last one of them. What was really innovative with Lockbit in particular, which was it was an NCA-led operation, so National Crime Agency over the United Kingdom, but that involved Europol, it involved, I might be wrong, but I'm pretty sure it involved Germany, US, a whole bunch of other people as well. And what they did there was they realized, okay, we can take offline some servers, but that's temporary. As you said, they can create new servers, they can spin the operation back up again. We can arrest some affiliates of it. We can also name the key actor behind it, but ultimately it will rebuild. So what they did there was really, really smart. In that, going back to your kind of question about what is a takedown, they said, well, everything in the criminal underground is based on reputation, right? There are alternatives to Lockbit, right? There's other ransomware groups out there. And if we can destroy the reputation of Lockbit so that nobody wants to work with them, it effectively removes them from the equation. Now, people will go to other ransomware groups, but it won't be this monopoly in size and things that I had before. And they were really effective at that by undermining their business completely. They hosted on the actual Lockbit leak site. They did the same sort of thing Lockbit did. They showed details of their affiliates, which is really important, even just the usernames of those affiliates, because that implies they have a lot more information on them that they just haven't chosen to release yet, because they're probably working on arrest cases and so on. And they also, most importantly, made it incredibly clear that for some of the biggest law enforcement in the world, there is a huge target on Lockbit, and anything that touches it will be looked at. So if you're now an access broker, like we talked about earlier, and you've got access to your Fortune 500 company, and you always worked with Lockbit because they were nice to work with, they gave you good rates and so on, are you really going to work with them, or are you going to look at the alternatives? You're going to look at the alternatives, right? So you're suddenly going to realize there's a wider market that I could possibly go to. And that's exactly what we saw with Lockbit. So Lockbit did limp on for a while. They inflated their numbers by re-releasing people they'd already actually breached, just to make it look like they were very much business as usual, which interestingly is the same tactic that most of their victims had to use over the years. When most people get breached, the first thing they do is they come out with a press statement saying everything is fine, there's nothing to see here, we're all good. And of course then, as the investigation goes on, they realize everything is not so fine. That's exactly what Lockbit did. But if we fast forward to today, Lockbit as it is essentially gone. There's a few smaller victims on a monthly basis, nowhere near the sort of revenue of the companies that they used to hit. And they're barely in like a top 10 in terms of ranking on victims. They've actually posted that they plan to release a new version of Lockbit in around February of this year. And I think that will be very interesting to see, because they will essentially be re-entering the market as just another player. They won't be like, oh, Lockbit have returned and we all jump on board. It will be very much a case of, okay, well, show us what you have. Is it any better than what else is out there? And it has to be substantially better, because we know you come with a lot of baggage. Law enforcement will be all over this. So unless your offering is considerably higher than anything else that is on the market, it's just not worth using. So that attacking the brand has a massive impact in a world that is based on reputation like cybercrime.
I think that's a very, very good take, and a very important take, because it's not a typical take that's out there, at least in the press, that damage of reputation. And I think especially about being so much better of an offer, I think on a technical note, to be honest, I don't see that coming, because those technical concepts we see out there right now are pretty good working, to be honest, in most of those cases. And I don't think there's a need for something completely new, and I cannot think about something completely that could be a revolution. I think what's always a case could be about you could get a higher share from us than from others, for example. Things like that. You could keep a higher percentage of the ransom than you would do with others. So a financial motivation could be out there. And when we talk about that damage of reputation, and I don't think it's only about a one certain group. That's the good thing. I think if you disrupt someone like Lockbit, you send out a message that says, if we can take down Lockbit, we can take down so many others. And if we can release the names in the end, ultimately, of affiliates, for example, we can do the same for every other group. Does that completely stop people from using those services? No, never. As you said, it won't be zero. But if we wipe out a few of them, that's already a success, because only a few of them generate so much damage in the industry, in governments, that I think it's worth the effort. And I think it's pretty much worth to do, because you have to do something about this. You cannot let it be Wild West that it used to be before. That's just not possible.
Yep, and in the case of ransomware in particular, we have seen some of the criminal forums and so on where ransomware is not acceptable to talk about, because they simply know it is such a high-profile crime that if there's any of the major groups, they have open law enforcement cases in every country in the world, because they've had a victim somewhere and the victim opened a law enforcement case, right? So as a result, you're bringing far too much heat on yourself as a community if you support ransomware, whereas I mean, it's still not a crime, but if you're supporting phishing or spam or something else, it's generally lower on the radar in terms of impact for people. So you can kind of get away with it. And I think we want to do that with crime in general. That, as I said, there will be always an acceptable level of crime within a society. But in the same way as we don't let people walk around the streets with like swords and just randomly kill each other anymore, that is absolutely not allowed. Once you get that within even a criminal society, that this is off limits. If you do this, everybody will shut you down. Then it drops some of those barriers down, right? So you're now within more acceptable levels of crime again, which is more manageable for the general population, especially if they've got kind of security software and things like that to help them, and some awareness as well about what to watch out for.
Yeah, and I think to sadly come to some kind of an end to the episode, I have one question left. But before that, as I said, I would love to talk about some other things, because when we talk about cybercrime, we always talk about ransomware these days. But I think there's so many things out there which are maybe not too technical. So I still see a lot of business email compromise, for example, that doesn't involve a lot of hacking, for example, that maybe involves one mailbox, sometimes not even one. Sometimes it's still impersonating someone. Very basic and easy things. And I think those things don't get too much of a news from time to time, because, it's not a company that's standing still for 2 weeks. It's just something that has a financial damage. Maybe it's a wire transfer of $1 million, which is an incredible amount of money, but in the end the company doesn't stand still, and so that the news is not there. And I think these things are also very, very important to speak about, also in terms of AI and how deepfakes are really working at the moment. The last question I would have, you said I should remind you about why a pie chart is not the best way to represent the market share of a ransomware group. Why is that?
So people naturally do it, right? Because they gather some stats of like different ransomware leak sites, and they total it up every month, and you throw it in Excel, as everybody does, and you think, okay, what way am I going to visualize this? So it's either going to be, let's be honest, pie chart, bar chart, something like that, right? So people naturally go for pie charts because they like that. And then what ends up happening is people look at this pie chart and they say, okay, well, this group currently has 20% of the market share, and this other group is so X% of the market share. But in reality, that's not true. So if we take another industry, if we take the technology or security industry, right, and you look at a pie chart of how much of the market, or let's say Trend Micro customers or somebody else and so on, that generally represents pretty much the entire world's possible organizations that you could sell something to, or most of them anyway, right? In the case of cybercrime, it doesn't. It's just the victims that month. There are, if you total up all the victims for ransomware in a given month, it could be several hundred organizations. There are millions of organizations out there. So your pie chart is actually only a tiny percentage of the addressable market, if you like. So then comparing these groups and saying, well, they've got 20% of the market, they've got 10% of the market, is meaningless. They've actually got 0.002 of the market, and these other ones are 0.00 something else of the market. So pie charts might help you show one group as bigger than another, but to deceive people into thinking that this is a market that's saturated, when in reality, they're barely scratching the surface.
I think that also pays into something I always tell my listeners. I'm incredibly cautious with cyber statistics in general. I most of the time don't use any of them. Why? Because on the one hand, they lack data. In most countries, we do not even have a real must to report a cybercrime. And even if we do have to report it, it's most likely like raising the hand and I was getting hacked, but there are no real details in it. And so many of these statistics I see is like, I show a statistic in a forum or, I don't know, in a keynote, and there will always be someone who for a reason can present the total opposite statistic most of the time. So when we talk about, best example is how fast a ransomware attack gets. Even the term attack is so much different for many of these people speaking about it. And in some of these statistics, that includes the whole chain of an access broker getting in, the time of being on a marketplace, the time of being sold, and then the actual impact that's being generated, while others only see the time of a group buying the access, timeline starts, until the impact, which is a total different ball game.
Yep.
And that's why it's not about I don't trust those statistics. It's just, I think many of these statistics, if we, let's say, make it a bit easier, every cybersecurity vendor in this market will find a statistic that will really play into that whole thing they want to bring out. And I don't say these are bad people. You have to do something. I always just tell my listeners, if you see a statistics, especially we have some papers in Germany about there's $1 trillion in damage every year and whatsoever. Like, these are models. And I don't say they are wrong. I just say these are not real numbers. These are models based on assumptions that we generated. Some of them have a brand reputation counted in. Some of them have only direct damage and whatsoever. And yeah, that's why I like your take on that, because I'm always very, very cautious when it comes to numbers in cyber.
Yeah, and even in the ransomware circles, I said, like, Lockbit were well aware that people were publishing, pie charts every month, and they'd artificially inflated their numbers so they'd look bigger in the market, right? So I personally am 100% in agreement. I don't like statistics in the security community because they're normally not comparing the same thing. One company will say, we saw 1 million attacks today on this server. It's like, did you see
what's an attack?
Did you see 1 million packets going to the server? Like, that's one attack, right? So, like, what is that? So you can't compare them, and it's kind of meaningless. What I value more is expert analysis and reviews, both in terms of, reviews of a security product, like somebody like a Gartner or somebody like that saying, we've reviewed this from every angle possible and we think it's actually really good. Or when you look at, like, the impact of cybercrime, that you have research teams at different security vendors who've looked at it from every different angle and say, we actually think this is the most impactful group, or this is the most part of the ecosystem, based partially on numbers. Like, we see more customers complaining about it, but also, like, the innovation they show, the quality of the code and the malware, all that sort of stuff coming together, and then giving an expert review. Those have more value than any sort of top 10 ranking tables and stuff like that.
I think that's a very good end to the episode. As I told you, I would be very, very happy if we could do another episode.
Sure.
Someone this year. Hopefully we will also find some way to meet each other again. I think we are working together for almost 3 years and we only managed to see each other once, and it was in Japan. Yep. So not really the direct way to meet each other if one lives in Ireland and the other in Germany, but yeah, we'll take what we got.
Yep.
Thank you very, very much.
Work on my German for the next podcast as well.
Hopefully.
At least one phrase somewhere.
I can always do it in English, so at least that's given. Thank you very much. It was a pleasure to talk to you, especially in the podcast, and I'm 100% certain that my audience will like this episode a lot. Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.